Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Jackson, and the focus is Jacksonian Federalism. Federalism was this concept in the United States government system of shared sovereignty between the federal government and the state governments. Each had its own responsibilities, and how they interacted was defined in the Constitution and through practice. And Jackson was foursquare on the side of the states' rights perspective, very Jeffersonian in his view when he said to Congress, "Nothing is clearer in my view than that we are chiefly indebted for the success of the Constitution under which we are now acting to the watchful and auxiliary operation of the state authorities. I cannot therefore too strongly or too earnestly, for my own sense of its importance, warn you against all encroachments upon the legitimate sphere of state sovereignty." Jackson was for the people, he was for the rights of the states. But only to a point. There was a line that could not be crossed, and one state in particular was going to try to cross it on his watch. In 1828, the federal government under John Quincy Adams' administration had passed a tariff, a high protective tariff that was eventually called by the South the Tariff of Abominations. It was overly intrusive on the rights of the South, just preferential for the people in the North. They thought it was unconstitutional, in fact, because it was not just for raising funds, it was specifically to protect domestic industries, which the people in the South actually thought was unconstitutional use of the tariff, and of course they thought it was bad policy. John Calhoun, the vice president of the United States under Jackson, was one of the leaders in the charge against this tariff. He said the right of judging in such cases is an essential attribute of the sovereignty of which the states cannot be divested without losing their sovereignty itself. According to Calhoun, the only logical conclusion with its state sovereignty clearly implies a veto on the action of the general government. Now, this was very Jeffersonian in his point of view, as Jefferson and James Madison had written essentially the same thing when they sought to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts back in 1798, using the state legislatures to try to do so. Now, that passed the state legislatures but didn't go anywhere on a national basis, and now Calhoun and many of his colleagues in the South, though, were bringing that back, asserting state sovereignty over the federal government. And at this point, Andrew Jackson simply drew the line. There was nothing in his being that he was going to permit to nullify or lead to secession against the Union. The Union was most paramount. Well, there was a dinner, a Jefferson Day Dinner, honoring Thomas Jefferson's birthday, April 13th of 1830, and all of Washington came to town. It was a big event. This was at the Indian Queen Hotel, and there were toasts to be had. And Jackson knew that Calhoun was going to say something on this issue, so he tried to get in front of it. And in his toast, he stood tall, said very sternly and simply, "Our Union, it must be preserved." Pause for effect. He stood standing. He expected everyone to stand, to raise their glass. "Our Union, it must be preserved." Well, John Calhoun came next after everyone quieted down, and he didn't back down either. He said, "The Union, next to our liberty, most dear, may we all remember that it can be only preserved by respecting the rights of the states and by distributing equally the benefit and burden of the Union." The lines were drawn and they were not backing away. This was 1830. We move forward to 1832. The new tariff was passed, but it wasn't enough to satisfy the South. And then just days after Jackson's re-election, the South decided to act. They called for a convention and it overwhelmingly passed an Ordinance of Nullification, again, echoing Jefferson and Madison from a few decades before. The tariff would no longer be enforced within the state boundaries of South Carolina after a certain date, a couple of months going forward. Well, Jackson was ready for this. He had been getting reports for months from Joel Poinsett, a former congressman who was pro-union from the western part of South Carolina, telling him that this was going to happen. And so Jackson was ready to go with his own Nullification Proclamation, where he made it very, very clear exactly where he stood. According to Jackson, "I consider then the power to annul a law of the United States assumed by one state incompatible with the existence of the Union, contradicted expressly by the letter of the Constitution, unauthorized by its spirit, inconsistent with every principle upon which it was founded and destructive of the great object for which it was formed. To say that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union, which was threatened by South Carolina in its nullification ordinance, is to say that the United States are not a nation, because it would be a solecism to contend that any part of a nation might dissolve its connection with the other parts to their injury or ruin without committing any offense. So this is where Jacksonian federalism clearly differed from Jeffersonian views of the world. Both states' rights, but Jefferson had written nullification or even secession. He liked a little rebellion now and then. That was all part of individual liberty, state sovereignty, and perfectly fine. Jackson was for states' rights, but only to a point. If it threatened the Union, if it threatened via nullification, he was going to stop it. Neither side was budging. And of course, Andrew Jackson didn't bluff. He went to Congress and he asked for authority to use force to enforce the federal statute within South Carolina. And while that was working its way through Congress, South Carolina was calling out its own militia. Jackson was getting his forces ready. In fact, he told Poinsett, in 40 days, I can have within the limits of South Carolina 50,000 men. And in 40 days more, another 50,000. The wickedness, madness, and folly of the leaders and the delusion of their followers in the attempt to destroy themselves and our Union has not its parallel in the history of the world. The Union will be preserved. Andrew Jackson wasn't going to back down. This was a fight to the death, and it was personal. So he's working to get the force bill through Congress, but there's other people in Congress working to try to get the temperatures down. And Henry Clay was helping to push through a new tariff, a graduated tariff where the rates would come down. And sure enough, South Carolina was appeased. They were willing to withdraw their Ordinance of Nullification in favor of this new tariff bill. Jackson said he'd sign the new bill, but only if his force bill was also approved. He wanted it made clear that he had the authority to use force if necessary, but then he eventually, 2 days before his inauguration, signed both the force bill and the new tariff into law, and just like that, the issue went away. There were actually lots of winners in this nullification crisis, as it was called. South Carolina actually got what it wanted. It got lower tariffs, so the threat actually worked. This thing worked pretty well for Henry Clay as the compromiser-in-chief behind the scenes, and he was smarting from having just lost to Jackson in the presidential election, so it was kind of a win for Clay. But of course, it's also a victory for Jackson. His strong stand to uphold the principles to protect the Union in the system where states' rights are preferred, but only to a point, Jackson prevailed. His own calculus, his own brand of federalism, he had no fear in standing up for his belief. Nothing new here. It had seen throughout his entire life, and he felt vindicated that his strong stand preserved the Union. And that is Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian Federalism from the life of Andrew Jackson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.